really. It's small.
Getting through it.
Nikki, if you remember, I was talking about those sign-offs and Elizabeth. You can kind of see one here. It's like. Get that official job and grab my water.
Not changed things.
Just let me know when you're
yeah.
Okay. All right. Welcome everyone, both here in person and anybody watching virtually. Welcome to the first what we call the NicTALKS of the semester. I'm Nick Galante. I'm one of the reference librarians here. Behind the camera is Nicole Rivera, another one of our librarians. Who, without her, this would not be possible. She's our tech whiz here. Anyway, today we are very excited to, sorry, I'm out of the frame apparently. We're very excited to have with us today history professor Braun Strumfels here talking about her research using foreign language sources in U.S. immigration history. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Lauren, and there'll be time for questions once you've done your presentation. So take it away.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm hoping to have time as well to think about how what I do might bring some insight or perspective into the questions that you're curious about, the types of research you're engaged in, or even the ways in which you're trying to shape the world to be maybe more just or different from the world in which we inhabit, and how academic work can help achieve that, right? So I am a historian of migration, which fundamentally is a pretty activist field among historians. I'll say that. So if you've heard me talk about anything before, you know that I'm really interested in the rise of barriers to the freedom to move, the origins of gatekeeping, so how we have these rules about who can and cannot move, and how we limit the mobility of people worldwide today. And the US, of course, being a leader among nations in establishing such a system. So it's kind of funny, right? A picture of me, I'm standing here, very meta. So I am going to talk today about using foreign language sources in U.S. immigration history in particular. And I'm here today also because I'll be giving a version of this talk at the Organization of American Historians conference on American history at the end of the week. So I appreciate you all for being a test audience for me and also giving some feedback and honest thoughts about what's interesting to you, what you want to know more about. If you have any commentary or anything that you think isn't working so well, I greatly appreciate your feedback. So to start off, right, I'm going to be talking specifically about my research experience, which is working with Italian diplomatic records. But I'll try to make some connections or ask you to invoke how some of this work might apply in your own areas of interest and connection. So this picture, I actually normally work in the archive alone. It's pretty lonely in there. Archival research is exciting. When you find something, it's like very exciting, but then there's also lots of interludes of where you're kind of alone working. But I've had an incredible opportunity to work one day last summer with a research assistant of mine, and so she took this cool picture of me working. All right, so the documents that you see stacked and piled all around us, we're going to dig into what those look like, what we can learn about them, and what are some of the challenges to working with them. Okay, so I peppered this with some photos of the actual work that I do, but I want you to think about maybe some of the benefits of working with these kinds of sources. So the challenges, right, of conducting research in foreign archives can prevent US-based scholars from doing this work. And I think actually one of the major barriers you saw, actually, if we go back to the first slide for a second here, right, is just like COVID was a huge barrier. This archive was closed for 2.5 years. No one could go in. It was really a huge problem. Then they came up with a system where you had to make reservations and you had only 4 appointments a month you could possibly have. This archive is open from 9:30 a.m. to 2 o'clock p.m. Monday through Friday, right? So there's just those kinds of limitations. Traveling, just trying to get there. But the perspective that they offer, I'll argue today, is absolutely essential. So what I'm hoping you'll see is that the benefits will outweigh the challenges and might inspire you to think about sources and ways of knowing about the past that you might be able to crack open because of your own knowledge of languages or your own communities in which you are embedded, in which you have access to these records or these experiences. So one of the things, right, that we see when we go into Italian diplomatic archives in particular is that we start to see the United States through Italian eyes. And this is important not just because Italy was one of the major sending states for the US population, and here where we live in the Northeast, right, we still have a significant Italian American population, right, here, including maybe some people in the room. But the other thing is that we see the United States through Italian eyes, in particular at the height of Italian mass migration. So when Italians were beyond a doubt the largest group that were entering the United States at the time, right at the moment that the US is trying to create this gatekeeping system. So Italians test these laws as they initially translate into policy, right? It's one thing to write a law in Congress, it's quite another to actually enact it. So that's what we see when we look through Italian diplomatic records. They fill in some critical gaps in the US record. So there was a fire at Ellis Island in 1897. It ripped through a number of buildings, destroying the records and also the station itself, right? So there was a period where migrants had to be detoured to what was the old station at the base of Manhattan, and we lost those records. So we don't actually know very clearly, like, what was the day-to-day experience like of migrants arriving? How were they processed? What about the people who objected to their exclusion and went through a process where they could actually, their case could be heard? We don't have any of those records because they were burned. But we do have insights from the Italian government because they were watching, keeping track, talking about cases, clipping news articles, as we'll see. Okay, so it fills in what is literally a hole in the U.S. record. So we also know that the period is very well documented by Italian diplomats. So these weren't just people who were like kind of curious what was happening. They were intensely focused on the experiences of their migrants who were highly mobile. So we think of the U.S. as a destination. We think people, once they get here, they stay put. No, not the case, especially for Italians who were one of the most highly mobile populations, about half of all Italian migrants who would actually return to Italy, which is the highest rate by far of any group. And so we can think about that. We also, by looking at these records, we globalize immigration policy history. So notice I'm using the IM, right? Thinking about how do people come here. But we also want to think about it as emigration. How do people leave? What structures, right? Their ability to exit. What paperwork and documents do they have to have? What permissions? What resources? And some of my students who are in our class right now are thinking about that, right? What resources shape mobility? But it also helps us, right? It reminds us that the U.S. couldn't control its borders alone, which I think is a really important lesson when we think about policymaking today, and you know, what system is just and reasonable for, you know, a country that proclaims the values of democracy, republicanism, and self-government. All right. So this file, it was the magic file that it just stood up on its own. It was so giant. And I'll mention that inside that dusty box, right, were some pretty cool finds. There was a commendation from the king to the ambassador. This is his personnel file from the second ambassador to the United States, Edmondo Mayor de Planche, who was in office from 1901 to 1909. The previous ambassador, so the office only becomes an embassy in 1893 as the U.S. government is trying to essentially sort of apologize for the lynching of 11 Italians in New Orleans. That ambassador served for 20 years. His personnel record got lost. It just says in the finding aid, it just says mancate, which means lost. So I don't know, you know, what happened to him. So we're thinking about, you know, all of these different ways in. Okay, so let's go forward. And let's think about what some of the records actually reveal. And then I'll ask you some questions about this. Okay, so here is a set of documents that come from the folder that was in that opening segment. Those are records from the consulate in New Orleans, in case you were curious. So most of the records that I work with in this archive are the records of the ambassador in the United States, that collection. And then I pull consular records because the different places in where consular officers were stationed. Some of these consuls don't exist anymore because the time population has shifted, right, and its composition in the United States. This particular material is relevant to the work that I'm doing right now, okay? But what we can start to see, right, is that when we focus on the relationship between Italy and the United States at the turn of the 20th century, we can expose what I argue are the integrated development of systems that control the outflow and the inflow of migrants. Again, we're thinking about this, right, as a globalized system that is, you know, primarily constructed, right, in the U.S. legislation, but not entirely and cannot entirely be controlled by U.S. forces or U.S. policies. So this, right, records like this deepen and expand our view of gatekeeping to include many kinds of border controls. And they help to contradict what the scholar who came up with the phrase remote control, Aristide Zolberg, called, quote, the constraint that arises from the unidimensionality of the concept of restriction. So that's a pretty heavy quote, but we're thinking about when we consider immigration restriction, right, putting up walls, barriers, borders, requiring certain paperwork, requiring certain conditions, right, to enter a country. If we think about it as being unidimensional only from the perspective behind the wall, right, we miss a huge part of that history. And that's what we're able to see when we reach out into foreign archives. So this particular set has some interesting aspects to it. On the right, we've got the signature of John Hay, the Secretary of State in 1904. We've got some scribbles we see right underneath that SS LaGuardia, the ship name. That's the ambassador writing, kind of being just like you do in your notes. You're like, oh yeah, that's important. Okay. So we see a little bit of personality there, a tiny bit, but it's otherwise a pretty formal letter. You can see Department of State at the top, right? We've got the date. You know, otherwise it's, you know, it's a pretty straightforward letter, right? I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your note of the 26th ultimo protesting against this, what does it say, right? The action of the immigration authorities at New Orleans in regard to the exclusion of certain immigrants entering that port on the SS LaGuardia. So that's a pretty neutral sounding statement, right? What does that sound like happened there to you, you know, those words? protesting against the action of the immigration authorities at New Orleans in regard to the exclusion. That's like bureaucratese, isn't it? So if we look at the newspaper on the left, it's an Italian, right? It's from an Italian language newspaper published in New Orleans. Again, a rich resource that's not well preserved. Okay, on the left, right, that headline says after the arrival of the ship Liguria, and then it's got a warning in the corner. Okay, telling us right about what's going to be the next ship to leave. So, on the one hand, right, the letter between the ambassador and his equivalent, right, the Secretary of State, is pretty dry. It's not very exciting, right, with the language in it. But when we start to dig into the archive itself and put it into context, we see a deeper record. So there's some brown shading on this letter. Does anybody know what that might be? What insight it might reveal about the relationship between these two things? Besides the fact that I've stuck them on one slide. There's some. I know I've got some plants in the room that know, but we'll wait and see if anybody else has any thoughts. If you've ever looked at, if you have letters or old newspapers that you've worked with or seen, or even old works of art, prints, photographs, do you ever notice the yellowing, right? It's from the acid in the paper. It's from the acid in the paper. So what do you think that dark box could be? If you just shifted it up a little bit, what's the same size as that dark box?
Newspaper article.
Exactly. So where were these two letters on the ambassador's desk in those files? Sandwiched together, exactly, Nora. So what we can start to see, and we'll notice it in a couple of other slides as well, what we start to see is the relationship between the materials within the archive itself, right? So it wasn't just that the ambassador was reading this letter from his equivalent, the Secretary of State, and maybe being annoyed that it was like not doing more. But what we also see, right, is that in reading this letter, he was also reading what the community of Italians in New Orleans were saying about what had happened. And I bet that he was unhappy about the tone of this letter and the response of the U.S. government. And we know that because other letters and reports later on confirm, right, that he was very frustrated with the way the U.S. government kept saying it's not our fault, we didn't do anything wrong. They detained every passenger aboard this ship initially. And it took them a week to process these people, and they kept them aboard the ship. Another thing that happens with the same shipping company later on, 2 years later, is that they detain 100 migrants aboard that ship, which was about 10% of the total. It's very high. Around 1 to 2% were typically excluded in this period. And the people who they decided would be sent back would not be accepted to the country. The shipping company puts in the city jail, just as a temporary holding place. They're like, we didn't have anywhere else to put them. The Italian government goes ballistic. They say this is not an action for a self-respecting state. You do not put, right, people in jail among common prisoners. Okay? They're especially upset about the lone woman who was to be sent back. They said she was jailed among prostitutes, right? That was morally, they were objecting to that. So I just want you to think about, right, how sometimes even really subtle parts of this record can reveal something bigger. Okay, so here's a letter that's actually in English, and that happens too. So I'm talking about using foreign language sources, but I'm also, wanting to note that some of this stuff is in English because this is the correspondence. This one is handwritten. It is dated May 10th, 1892. And what we notice about this is actually also interesting is what's in the background there. And this is fancy, right? So we can see like the words that are behind the letter. Can you see what that says? Does anybody know what that is back there? We're all squinting. You can look at the other screens too if it's helpful. You can sort of read it. It says congressional record. So does anybody know what that thing is? So I know my poli-sci friends in the room might. I'm going to put you on the spot. The congressional record. Does anybody know what that thing is for? Maybe. No, I'm not sure. It's the record of all the laws that are debated in the U.S. Congress, both houses of Congress. Okay, so it has the text of any laws it's proposed, debated, voted upon. It has the votes. It has whatever. When someone comes and testifies, on behalf of or against particular legislation, it prints all of it. It's an incredible resource. So what's it doing in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? That's kind of weird, right? So these are some of the questions that you can ask and start to answer. Like, why is that there? Why did they care about this? That leads, right, to the conclusion that I've reached. So I mentioned the New Orleans lynching, which was the nadir, the lowest point of relations between the U.S. And Italy. And the U.S. would not, they knew who had perpetrated the lynchings. They were very well known. They were leaders in the city of New Orleans, but no one would prosecute them, either at the local, state, or national level. There was no one would pay criminally, right, for the murders. So the Italian government tried to support a bill that would have protected any Italian national murder in the United States. You think that should happen, right? Not always, okay? So what ends up going on, right, is that this bill, the story of the bill is not so relevant to what we're talking about here today, but in the process of that bill, this letter shows up. And there's some language in the letter that tells us about the relationships between the diplomats and lawmakers in Washington, D.C. And these relationships weren't just the formal stuff we saw in the last letter, right? So in this letter, there's words like, my dear Marquis, right? And the bill you mentioned to me. So what does that tell us about their relationship and how much U.S. law was interesting to Italian diplomats? More than just a little, right? They were paying close attention. That copy of the congressional record isn't that bill I was talking about, the Dolph bill, which by the way never passed. That was for what was known as the Geary Act, which was a 10-year extension of Chinese exclusion that actually made it more difficult for any Chinese national who was already resident in the United States. He or she had to provide these certificates to anyone who asked, especially law enforcement, that said that they had a legal right to be in the country. Okay, so that's really important here. That's all very much in the background. Okay, so this is part of what I argue, right, is a relationship of partners in gatekeeping. So let's think about some of the fun challenges to working with these kind of sources. We've been thinking about the benefits, and I know you're all like ready to go get on a plane and go back to Rome and go dig in these documents. But let me tell you, it's a little hard. It's a little hard to do. Okay. So while we can see right before that the nature, right, of the relationship between Italian diplomats and U.S. policymakers and immigration officials was fairly close and intimate, and sometimes even personal, what we also see is that understanding that relationship requires a set of skills that I had to develop over many years. So this archive is, first off, disorganized and difficult to access. If you are a historian or a person who is used to working in U.S. archives, you will cry when you go into this archive because it's just so dramatically different. And I'm not even talking about working like in the really well organized and and kind of well supported U.S. archives. I mean, it's really dramatically different. It's basically two rooms in the corner of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So what we also see, right, is that the first challenge to working with these records is just getting in the door. So when I went in 2004, the first time I went in, and I was like, maybe I'll find this, maybe I'll find that. It took me several days to even figure out where the archive was located. You would think that would be easier. It wasn't, right? Because it's not well publicized or well known, and it's in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is off in the corner of Rome, right across from the Foro Italico. For anybody who just went to the soccer game, you were right next door. That's pretty much the only time you're ever going to go over there, probably on your own accord. But that corner of the city is the fascist era buildings, and that's where the ministry is located. I had to have a letter at that point, as a graduate student, I had to have a letter from my university saying what the heck I was doing and that I was legitimately doing research for a degree. And then I had to take that letter, I had translated it myself, I had to take it to the US Embassy and get another letter from them, and then I had to go to the archive and explain myself and get access. Because again, you're going on a regular basis to work in this archive, it's like going in and out of the State Department. So you have to have a special badge, you have to use your passport as documentation to come in every day. I used to have a letter, I still have it, that's like, says I can come in. I finally stopped having to use a letter in like 2018. Because now they have a computer system, which is in and of its own difficulty of trying to figure out. But, right, when you actually do figure out where it is and you make it inside, it's only open from 9:30 to 2:30. Not a lot of time. It's not even really a full day, right? As I said, it's not the kind of archive that you're just going to pop into while you're there being a tourist or, on you're there for a conference, which sometimes historians will do. We'll go somewhere for a conference and we'll go to one day in an archive and we'll just hoover stuff up and then process it later. You really can't do that. It's just not, it doesn't work that way. So in larger US archives, you page documents, you say, this is what I want to look at, and somebody brings it to you. Sometimes right away, sometimes within the hour. Here, they bring it to you the next day. And now you have to register online. So all of these things have to be built in, right? And these are some things I want you to think about. Like, wow, your experience of researching or of working with the records that are important to you might not be exactly this story. I want you to think about what are some of the barriers that might be in the way for you answering the questions with the records that you want, or even accessing them, figuring them out. What would the archive look like to help answer the kinds of questions that you're interested in, and thinking through maybe some of the challenges. You might not be able to address them initially, but if you're prepared, it does help, right, smooth the process. I think one of the things that Rome taught me is things will never go as expected, and you've got to roll with it. So, good life lesson, right? Okay. So these records are not well conserved. As you can kind of see, they're basically just piled in there and compressed down. They're not in separate folders. They're not well conserved. They're out of order often. The finding aids are very, very basic and 25, 35 years old. So you're not OCR searching and going right to what you need. So that's another thing as well. But what I want to say is that it shouldn't prevent you from, if there's a set of records that's messy and difficult, sometimes it's worth the effort. And that's part of your ability to kind of figure it out, right? And to think, you can hone that ability to figure it out, to put it in context. And then that's a really incredible contribution that you can make, right, to the knowledge that we have. So my documents are almost all handwritten before 1906. 1906, I think they bought a typewriter because I started to see a difference, and I was like, oh, hallelujah. So here's a tweet I sent last summer, and this was one of the worst examples I came across in my work last summer. But this one has some fun things. Like, first of all, this is not one of the typical authors. When you work with manuscripts, you get to know handwriting, just like members of your family or something, and you kind of can decipher it. But this guy was somebody I hadn't seen much, and he has this nasty habit of cross-outs and then overwrites, which is just, it was really bad. The second page was worse. But yeah, so that's an issue, right, that we see in working with this stuff. And the other thing too is, this is high diplomatic language. It's very formal. No Italian person talks like this anymore, even though they tend written Italian, like in university settings or academic settings, does tend to be a lot more formal in some ways in their style of writing. But like this you have to like decode it, and this takes a little bit of work. This is one of my examples of the things. Yeah, exactly. So you're looking at that and you're like, oh God. There's a couple of clues. This is the ambassador, the second guy who was in office from 1901 to 1909. He has terrible handwriting. It's so bad. The guy who preceded him, who is the main subject of my book, is better. This guy is the worst. So what you see here, though, there's a couple of clues like that you can, again, even if you don't have any idea what's going on here. So like if we've got, I never use the little red thing. It's not.
It doesn't show up on that screen.
It doesn't show up on that screen.
No.
Oh, okay. So if you look up at the top, can you see Washington, D.C.? Maybe in some of the ones on the other screens. You can see Washington, D.C. There's a date. You can see the number 12, right? It's 12 April 1905. Up in the corner is some scrawl. I know that's Esteri Roma, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just something, again, you see it enough, you kind of figure it out. And then there's some numbers. That's just some, I've been working here since 2004. I still don't know what the numbers mean. I think they're making them up. Underneath it says, in Italian, immigrazione. That's the subject. Again, you start to decipher. This is a report, very typical. It's a report from the ambassador. He doesn't even sign it, right? He's just sort of writing, this is his draft. And he's sending it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like his boss. There's always a subject. The subject's in the left. So I know when it was sent, I know who it was sent to, I know the format, and I know the topic is immigration, right? So even as I start to try to decipher what it says, at least have some kind of framework to understand what's happening here. And there's some words that are already like jumping out. If you want to see this is actually longer. That's the inside. Doesn't get any better, folks, when you open the inside. Yeah, he really went to town here. But what we start to see also, so like here, these are the names of the southern states. So the work that I'm doing now focuses on Italian migration to the American South. So even if I'm like, I'm not sure what's happening here, there's some stuff that's jumping out that I'm like, oh, this is important, right? Because I see him listing, he's saying like in the states of South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Over here, he's talking about the Southern Railroad Company and the Southern Pacific Railroad Company, the Gould system. He's talking about how railroads were financed in this period. So there's, right, you start to bounce off these intersections. And maybe at the time, you're like, I don't really know what's important about that. You're building and building and layering and layering and layering sources in your brain, getting somewhere. Okay? And that's really, right, the construction of, the historical record is messy and incomplete, always. So it's our job, right, to try to make sense of it and of its context and of its meaning. So that letter is, that one's a hot mess. And then, see, Clara went with me, so she took some cute pictures. So that's me, right? Perfect outfit for that day, because that building is very white. That's the side entrance of the ministry. If you look around the corner, if you type in, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you'll see the big main entrance with the flags waving. And no, I don't get to go in that entrance. I gotta go on this side one. If you want to cry a little bit, you could look up Reading Room, Vatican Archives. And then you'll see the comparison of where I have it. It's like, yeah, not even. Yeah, go ahead, Stephanie. Go drool over that one. All right, so, yeah. Just look it up. I see some of you have devices. Okay, so one of the things, right, that you might be asking yourself is like, why even bother with this stuff? It's hard to get in. It's hard to decipher. It's hard to figure out. It's not easy to work in. You can't just go grab a coffee easily. What the heck, right? Like, why do this work? And one thing that I've noticed anecdotally, so I don't have hard evidence for this, but I was reviewing our book, the program for the conference I'm going to. You can see it's the biggest organization of practitioners of American history. So college professors, teachers, and the K-12, library and museum professionals are members, right? Think about that, sort of the general constituency. There's a lot of contemporary work there, like 21st century history that's happening, topics that are much more recent. And my hunch is that some of this is happening because, like, not all grad programs require language now. Not all, right? We're thinking about the accessibility of sources, and sometimes that's important. You got to do the work. You have to be able to point to the sources, work with the sources, as historians. But I wonder, we think about, right, what are the stories that are not being told because you know, it's challenging, or we don't have the skill sets. We're not developing them anymore. All right. So I'll say, right, that these records make a compelling case for the necessity of understanding the evolution of immigration policy in a transnational framework. And again, I want to emphasize for you all in the room, you know, kind of coming at this maybe out of interest, or, you know, not as necessarily as practitioners in the field, you would be really surprised at how many immigration scholars work only in Anglo sources and Anglo historiographies, English language. Which, you know, is one of my missions as a historian in this field, is really to make transnational the work that we do and fully reflect, right, the, you know, the transnational frame of which we must examine migration. So I'll say in the last slide here, and then we'll open up to some questions or observations, are some takeaways. Like, this is my answer to the question, why do this? Why do this hard, expensive, far away work? Last summer there was a strike. Strikes in Italy tend to be pre-announced, transit strikes. So I woke up, no, I'll tell you this whole story. So I had a shakerato, which is a delicious iced espresso that you can get in the summer. And I had it at 5:30 p.m. Bad idea. I woke up, I had horrible heartburn. Could not sleep. It was terrible. All I needed was like a Pepsid, just a simple over-the-counter heartburn drug. Did I have it? No. Were any pharmacies open? Maybe. But I didn't want to go to a pharmacy, the only 24-hour pharmacy, and have them not have the Pepsid. So I tried to call them. Then I'm like, well, how do I say that? Because that's not the name of the drug, that's the brand name. So I'm trying to type in what is Pepsid. This is what it's called. How do you say this in Italian? How do you say heartburn? Because it's not a word phrase that I knew. It's pretty much as you would think. It's pain of the heart. So I'm like, okay, this is what I'm going to say. And I'm trying to dial the 24-hour pharmacies, which there are 3 in the entire city. No one's answering. I was like, you're 24-hour pharmacy. You have to be open. And I'm like, should I take the bus? Because there's a night bus, and it's pretty fine when you're by yourself, even as a woman being out late at night. I was like, should I take a taxi? What should I do? I paced the room. This goes on for about 4 hours. I'm like, well, maybe I'll work. No, I can't work. Then I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to the pharmacy. But at that point, it was like 6 a.m. And I was like, I might as well just go to the 8 a.m. pharmacy and get it done. Great day, right? Things are going really well for me. Got like 1 hour of sleep. And then I'm like, I got to leave to get to the archives before the transit strike. Because again, there's no way to get here without taking, usually I was taking a metro to a bus. Multiple, transit steps. So I leave the house at like 7 o'clock to get there because the transit strike was going to start at 8:30. So I had to be at the archive by like 8:15 to miss, so that I wasn't going to get stuck, right, on the transit strike. So I go to the pharmacy, I get my medicine, I'm finally feeling better, of course, by then. I get there, I get to the archive, I'm just sitting outside for like 30 minutes, just like sitting there, and then I'm like, well, I guess I'll try to go inside, because it opens at 9, right? So I get my document, go inside. They let me in, they don't say anything. I walk down the hallway, I come in, one of the people who pulls the documents, he's pushing the cart by, and he's like, well, what are you doing here? He's like, we don't open until 9:30. And I was like, I can't even explain to you what my night is. I'm like, but he let me in. He let me in. So anyway, yeah. So that was my day. Anyway, why do I put myself through this? Because I think it's not just important to my own work. I think it's important to the illumination of what we know about early U.S. gatekeeping. Okay, so we can see these things, right, when we look at this record. We can see the foundations of qualitative restriction emerge in a much more complete way. So what's qualitative restriction? That precedes quantitative restriction, which we still have to some degree today. It says that you certain qualities, right, you could not come into the country. So it had to do with supposed criminality, disease, poverty as it was loosely assessed. Sometimes women got caught up in this net more. Later it was political beliefs. You couldn't be an anarchist and out of the country. You couldn't have committed certain crimes of moral turpitude. Again, open to interpretation. The Italians were always like, is this a crime of moral turpitude? What about this? And the US government is kind of like trying to answer them. But they're trying to figure it out so they can explain to their citizens and be accurate about what's happening and who can come into the country. Okay, so we see those foundations really clearly and much more clearly. We also see diplomacy, right, as a tool for making immigration policy. And that's something that I think is underappreciated and definitely could be more well understood in both in a historical sense, but also in a contemporary sense, right, as we continue to negotiate the rules and the barriers and the borders that limit mobility today. We also can see, right, that the United States, as I argue, was the first partner in gatekeeping, and that's the title of my forthcoming book out in November, that Italy's attempts to manage migration in cooperation with the United States profoundly influenced the action of sending states for decades, including and up until the current moment, right? We're talking about negotiations with Canada, negotiations with Mexico, the quote-unquote remain in Mexico policy. You know, really, this is very, very prescient. And then finally, right, I think that working in foreign archives, especially in Italian diplomatic archives, right, provides evidence for how the politics of sending states shaped U.S. immigration policy, that it wasn't just a one-way street, right, that it was a two-way street, and that U.S. policy also influenced policy in different nations, which helps to actually decenter the United States. It's not just us making these laws and everyone else has to follow our rules. It shows how critical foreign partners were to the creation of an effective gatekeeping regime. So the U.S. could not control its borders alone, and Italian encounters with U.S. immigration officials fill out the otherwise limited early picture of enforcement at the origins, the first 10 years of a federal gatekeeping system. So on the right, just fun stuff you find sometimes in the archives. This is obviously a letter sent to His Excellency, the Baron Mayor de Planch, Ambassador of Italy in Washington, D.C., sent from New York on June 15, 1905, from the Bollettino della Sera, an Italian language newspaper published in New York. You can subscribe for 1 year for $4. And keep in touch, right, with the needs of your community. That also, these newspaper clippings, which are not preserved in any, you know, repository, significant repository in the United States, give us that insight of, you know, how the Italian government and how Italians were experiencing, right, conditions here in the United States and challenges to their freedom to move. So I'll say with that, that was my first day back after 2018. I was there in 2020 and was on a Fulbright and was ordered to leave by the State Department before I could get anywhere. So this was 5 years, very much wanting to be back, and that was the first day. So I happily took a photo of my little workstation there with my big pile of documents waiting for me, my Zotero open, and my notes ready to go. So I want to, conclude by thanking you all for coming on this journey with me, and ask if there are any questions. There's, you know, I tweet about immigration, history, and policy things, but also, you know, some other topics sometimes. Thank you. So, do you have any questions? Anything that was interesting? Sometimes I ask my students anything surprising, interesting, or troubling about what I've just the journey I've just taken you through.
I don't remember the online one.
Any thoughts that are, you know, bouncing off in your own heads about stuff you're interested in or curious about? Yeah, go ahead, Ava.
Focus on Italian.
Why the focus on Italians? That's a great question. So I always get, are you Italian? And the answer is no, not at all. And then the next, depending on who I'm talking to, if it is an Italian in Italy, they're always like, why? Why? And what I'll say is that when I was when I was young and 14 years old, I went to Europe. I had the great privilege of taking one of those 14-day go everywhere crazy trips, right? But where I got to see several countries on the continent for the first time. And oh God, I fell in love with Rome in particular. Italy, but Rome. And I was like, I'm going to learn Italian. I'm going to do all these things. It's going to be great, right? And then that just wasn't possible. The town where I lived definitely wasn't teaching Italian in high school. I learned Spanish, and I became very interested in the history of Spain. And so it was always like this side interest that I kind of had in my pocket, but no like reason for it that I could rationalize. And then when I went to graduate school and I started to get interested in immigration policy history, again, it made no sense. And I had a professor who I'm on a panel with this summer, who I still work with, and she said, if you're interested in graduate school in history, you should learn another language, a third language, because I had Spanish and English. And I was like, great, I'm going to learn Italian now, excellent, because I have the courses, I have them accessible to me, so I started learning Italian, and again, it was just something I enjoyed. And then when I went to graduate school, again, it was a side thing, and then I said, I'm going to study Hispanic migration to the American South. And a colleague, an advisor of mine, he said, oh, he was a historian who had worked in the Vatican archives. And he said, I saw this weird stuff in this archive, like the Valentines going to farm cotton in the American South. He's like, it was really strange. It wasn't my stuff, so I just, I didn't, but it was weird, like memorable enough, like, what was that? I was like, I don't know. So I started pulling the thread. Like, it was literally like one skinny little thread. And I was in Chicago, and I was like, well, what can I find out about this? Not that much, but I kept pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling that thread, and then it's multiple books. So, you never know, right? Like, this pile of nonsense could be a pile of nothing, but it could be something incredible. When I'm trying to think, like when you put in, you kind of trust that there's something there. I was just thinking yesterday about like the trusting yourself is a major missing component, right? When we're thinking about, for me as an academic, writing and publishing more, but maybe for you, right? Places in which you want to make a contribution. And it's like, well, what do I really have to say? Or why should people listen to me? You're like, I'm just whomever I am, But I think if you, like when you trust, it's not just trust that you have something important to say, but like that you don't have to do it the way other people have done it, that's a kind of an opening, an invitation, like this was a weird thing. And it made no sense. But now it does. Now it does. And I'll say one last thing, David. Going in this last summer and pulling that first file and opening it, and I hadn't actually, this is consular records of New Orleans. I was like, I saw all these stories that I knew the background for. Like finally the whole picture was clear. After, this is my sixth visit inside, over years. But that's where I can see, like these records are my career. This archive. It's big and powerful, and it says a lot, not just about immigration policy, but about labor history, what's happening to Italian workers who were working all over the United States and then often in very abusive situations, and the relationship between it and the U.S. So, yeah. Thank you for asking. You got a long answer. Is anyone else brave enough to ask me a question? Yeah. So
I'm kind of going down a different way,
Yeah.
but I'm interested in personal knowledge management. You have a picture of your Zotero there.
I'm so glad you asked.
So I'm interested in how do you keep the records, your notes, your
So
analysis.
glad
so
you
can
asked.
use it. Yeah.
I love that you bring us there. Yeah, so, and this is, we've, again, in the students in my classes, depending on which class you're in, I talk to you a lot about how to organize your notes and how to approach, questions that might not have a straightforward answer, which is a lot of questions, right? So I didn't have Zotero. It didn't exist when I first started working with these documents. I still have photocopies in a milk crate from when I was in college, and I will tell you that I used them during the pandemic, and they are so helpful. So, my initial effort was like I would get different sticky colored labels, and I would write, in the same formula, whatever was in the file, and then I would try to sort them. Zotero is magical for anybody working on a project where you've got a lot of research sources. It's free. It syncs to the cloud if you set up an account, so your research database is safe. If any of you are going to embark on a capstone project, I highly recommend you consider using Zotero and setting it up for yourself. It's not linked to your Cedar Crest, so you can take it with you. Right? Pardon. Versus something like Mendeley, which I think is linked. Sometimes in the sciences they use that. All right, so Zotero, you can kind of see that list. So Zotero lets you create different folders or repositories, and then there's different kinds of documents that you can enter. You can also use the function in some systems that you can add directly to Zotero with the plugin, or you can download that RAS file and it will populate, right? The nice thing is that there's a pane for notes, and so I kind of try to use Zotero as my ground zero database, but I also use a program called Scrivener to draft. Scrivener is amazing and fabulous, light years better than Word if you're writing anything, you know, that's longer and more complicated, whether it's a academic work or something, you know, memoir, a book, a play, whatever. Scrivener is great. But I put some in Scrivener, but I keep this as the main place. So what I ended up doing, I actually stopped bringing my computer because I had to lug it up, as I mentioned, subway, bus, walk through the door. Not great, right? I actually ended up using this little notebook. I would take notes, observations. That wasn't great. That was earlier. I was doing that. But I ended up using my Passion Planner, which, you know, again, if you're my student, you've heard me talk about this thing. So this is just, I use this as it's a journal. I mean, it's a journal slash calendar slash, I use it very creatively. But in the back, I mean, if you've ever used a bullet journal, there's like bullet journal pages. I wish I had that one from last year. I ended up recording because I was trying to be kind of fast. Again, I still had limited. It was like, you know, I got them to give me 6 days, but that was like all I had, you know. And so I wasn't trying to do what I had done when I had months and months of archives, which was read everything as I was finding it, take notes as I was finding it. I was like, I just need to like understand basically what this is, organize it roughly, and hoard it out. So what I ended up doing was making these lists and coming up with little like symbols that were meaningful for me. I started using a TurboScan scanning app. Not, you know, I'm not a shill for them or anything, but a scanning app that allowed me to sort into folders. And instead of what I used to do, which was take one picture of each document and label each document, I mean, I'm telling you, I have years of this kind of stuff. This time around, I took sets. So I started labeling sets. And it would be like, because that's a set, right? It's like that one that I showed you before, you know, the letter from to the Marquis Imperiale, the congressional record, some other reports, maybe there's a newspaper clipping, right? That's all one set about the passage of that bill. So then I would label that set. And I would take the photos, and in the TurboScan app, the scanner app, my iPhone, I've got that set as a PDF. And it's all together and it's all organized. Because the thing is that you have to be super organized and consistent. Like whatever method I found, you just have to be consistent. Because you're going to get back, you're going to be like, oh, you got this thing. Or you're going to be drafting months later or years later. And you have to be able to go back. I just proofed my book, and I had to check footnotes on stuff that I initially looked at in like 2005. And that, you know, my Zotero doesn't go that far back, but it goes pretty far back now. It goes back to 2014, almost 10 years. So yeah, that I would say. So what I ended up doing actually is just bringing in this and just cataloging the sets, and then at the end of the day, translating the sets into Zotero and tagging and taking notes when I would see stuff to try to spark my memory later on. I talk sometimes about your current self helping your future self. Like how can current self now do something that future self will benefit from, you know, right? Because we're not kind to future self, and we don't trust future self sometimes. Like so like I open a Scrivener file and I'll put in there, you know, little things that I'm seeing, just little notes, or I have a tag that's just called to read that I frequently update. You know, is that?
Yeah.
I would love to have more conversations about methods.
Oh, I would love to.
Yeah, because I think I'm curious too, you know, and I think the reflection of like for our students who are who are envisioning cap zones, actively working in cap zones, like
Yeah.
developing the habits from the beginning. Because one of the things also that's important, I think, is not that you whole hog copy somebody else's method, but that you kind of test some stuff out before, you know, the stakes are high, and you figure out what works best for you, and then you lean into that. Because ultimately, right, knowing how to keep track of tons and tons and tons of information is a great skill.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks for asking these questions. But yeah, this stuff is fun. It's rare that I even get to show this stuff. Like when I first went in, I mean, now the quality of what I take with my iPhone, I'm amazed. When I first went in, I had a desktop. Maybe it had 8 megapixel camera or 4 megapixel camera that I had set up on a little tripod that I carried with me in a big case. You know, and I would like try to set it up and take these pictures. The pictures half of them are blurry. I mean, they're like garbage now, you know. And I snap with the scanning app on the iPhone. And like, you can, like, sometimes I have newspapers that I fold out and they're this long, and I can stand like this, take a picture, and zoom in and read the text. Whoa! Yeah, it's amazing. So, anyway, well, I hope all of you got something out of this. I don't know. I'm not going to make you share. But if you wanted to, about how, if you have anything popping off or anything that you're thinking about, I would love to hear. So you can tell me, like, privately. Go ahead.
Alright, so I know I asked the question of like why the focus on like Italians,
Yeah.
but like why focus on this specific period in
Ah.
time when there's like so much history? Why
Yeah, and in fact, you know, again, I was saying for Italians, like working on the turn of the 20th century, they're like, that happened yesterday. You know, like when it's a country that has thousands of years of documented history, they're like, what? That's not important. This period. So Jhumpa Lahiri, who is, she's a Bengali American fiction writer. She writes a nonfiction now too. She writes only in Italian now. She won the Pulitzer for The Namesake, which is an absolutely incredible work of fiction about immigrant identity and kind of the in-betweenness. She says that she says for herself, I feel like I have to tend to the garden of Italian. Because it also makes no sense for her either. People are like, why? You won a Pulitzer. Why are you obsessed with figuring out how to write in Italian? But I think that for me, this period is like, I was drawn to it. Like, it's a period where, I mean, I'm teaching a whole class on this semester, but it's a period where, like, it was such a tumultuous time in American politics, culture, economic life, right? It's like the height of Italian migration into the country. You know, there were technological advancements that people thought were going to ruin the country or make it, you know, make our future like absolutely perfect. It was like dystopia, utopias were clashing. You know, labor, right, was at its, some ways, you know, was at its ascendancy. In other ways, right, was struggling for respect. I just have always found interesting questions in this period and continue to find them. And I think the other part of the first question about why Italians and why this period is because I think it really shows us something profound about the system of gatekeeping that functions today. So it's like really those origins got to go there. There, I was more succinct with any of them with any other question. I can be short, I promise. I'm having fun. Thank you for listening.
It's more like content based
Yeah.
than the actual methods behind it. But you talked about like Italy and the U.S. being like the first partners in gatekeeping.
Mm-hmm.
But you also mentioned this was after the Chinese Exclusion Act. So that was unilateral, right? It was just the U.S. saying no.
Yes, and part of what happens though with Chinese exclusion, well, is that China at that point, right? China is not a strong diplomatic state to counteract, right, what's happening in the U.S. Although they make efforts, but inside the United States, Chinese nationals object to the Chinese Exclusion Act through the courts. And they actually are pretty effective at challenging the constitutionality, using some principles that are quite quite fascinating from a legal history standpoint, right? So they challenge using writs of habeas corpus, which in Latin means show me the body, saying you don't have a right to hold me in violation of this law. The law itself is, it should be declared unconstitutional. It's really interesting. And if you're this work, there's a number of historians that have really dug into this work, and their scholarship shifted the field. We used to talk about immigration policy and restriction, really starting with quantitative restriction, 1924. And then historians came along and they were like, no, you must look at Chinese exclusion. That's the origin. And so the whole field's kind of pivoted around that framework. So I come along and I'm like, okay, yes, Chinese exclusion is the legal parameters. Chinese exclusion, leads the Supreme Court to say that Congress has the sole power to regulate the borders and immigration. You might think it's president, it's actually not, it's Congress, right? So all that comes from Chinese exclusion. It sets up, but Chinese migration is at its height in this period around 70,000 people. Italians are showing in the hundreds of thousands, right? So what happens then is from Chinese exclusion, setting those laws and those parameters, and this sets some Supreme Court cases that codify the principles that allow the federal government to carry out, right, this enforcement. Then the first group of people who actually test the laws in action, in mass, are Italians.
How'd it go then? How did that test go? In your estimation?
I say that it was messy and it was uneven. But like the U.S. government learns from Chinese exclusion, so they see, oh no, that certain cases are successful in the courts. The Chinese can use the courts to litigate against these restrictions. So guess what they do? They say, well, Congress has the sole authority, and so we're going to create an administrative track. And if you have an objection to how immigration law is being applied in your case, you can't actually object through the regular judicial system, and you can't take it to the Supreme Court. You're on a totally other track, and that persists today, which is why people in immigration detention can sit there for years with no charges and no hearings and no cases. That is not permitted in the regular judicial system, right? Two tracks. That's Tori Hester's work right there. So that's part of it too, right? The U.S. government's like, oh God, okay, we tried to keep Chinese workers out, and they're figuring out how to challenge that. So let's come up with a different system, right? And then Italians are like, actually too many times that are undesirable, quote unquote, are entering the country. So we need more restrictions. And then we think about right, the system is very reactive, and I think that also helps to remind us that it's all been created. It doesn't have to exist. There's not like this. It's not like it's always been that way, or So I think it allows us to open back up this question of what, again, how should borders function in a society, right, that has as its principles democracy and self-government. So I told you immigration historians, right? Like, poke. I want you to think about this now. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, another thing about the timing of the too many undesirables and the anti-Italian racism. Italians weren't considered, white for such a long period of time when they were drafting.
They had Thomas Guglielmo says that they had color privilege. So they were discriminated against, but they weren't active, they sort of
it was
in this gray area. They faced violence, they faced repression, they faced an incredible amount of discrimination. Not to diminish that, but I think they were able to kind of navigate this space in this what some historians say is kind of in between. But the first half of my book talks about actually how the anti-Italian vitriol that was stirred up by these claims of mafia influence helped to shift the way the Italian government related to the U.S. in the aftermath of the lynching, which shapes policy, immigration policy. So there's plenty of really heinous cartoons and other things from the period. You can, so we keep kind of trading which group is the most, feared. What the qualities that supposedly are the most dangerous. You see some of these some of the stuff gets recycled.
When does the book come out?
November.
And if you want to point up to your right hand corner, it's on the screen on the.
Wonderful. I'm gonna green screen that. Fabulous. Yes, please. I hope you might be interested in coming back where I'll talk more explicitly about the research in the book. This book was many years in the making. I'm very proud of it. And I'm excited for people to start reading it.
That's the one we're doing next month, right? In April?
That's the third book. That's the second book, the third major project. That's my edited collection, my co-author for my edited collection, Managing Migration in Italy and the United States, which has chapters about the origins of international policing. To speak to what Nick was just asking about. My stuff on Italian migration in New Orleans, so this Berea incident stuff, and messy border controls there at a different place. It's got contemporary stuff about the context of this creation of a crisis at the border in Italy and the United States and how that fuels policy, right? The fear of a crisis. That's a contemporary piece that's in that book too. So my co-editor will be here from Rome in last week of April, Wednesday the 26th. If you're still watching, folks at home, please come back for that. That'll be great, and we'll be in dialogue. So he's an esteemed historian of U.S. Italian diplomatic relations. He's written 6 or 7 books.
So if you like this, there's more where this
We'll
came
have fun.
from.
So, all right. Thank you for spending your time.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. This has been awesome.
Very appreciative of you as an audience.
So yeah, a little bit of advertising there. I can hop back from the frame.
Yeah.
That helps. So yeah, as Lauren and I were just talking about, she's going to be back with us next month, about a month from now, with her co-author to talk a little bit more about Italian immigration and
Diplomatic history, and we'll also talk more about this idea of managing migration, like how do countries cooperate, and what are the ways we see that in the historical record, and then maybe the ways in which it continues to manifest today, and have some interesting stuff I think to say too about the Italian perspective on the U.S. from a vero Italiano, so legit.
thank you guys again. Thank you to anybody who was watching virtually and anybody who will watch this, because this will be available on the library YouTube channel probably like just a few minutes from now. So
Fabulous! Look at that. I have cards too, which I know you all want to take. It's a big box of them. If you don't know where to find me, I'm practicing. For
Don't forget to follow our Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, which is mentioned on our stream if you want to go check that out. But it is Cedar Crest College, Cressman Library.
Which email address is